During one of the darkest times in American history, a huge debate kicked off. And it wasn't just about how to fix a broken economy. It was about what the country itself should look like, what it should feel like to live in. This was a battle between two completely different visions for the future. A tale of two Americas that, well, were never really built. I mean, think about it. The Great Depression wasn't just some financial slump, it was an existential crisis. When the old ways of doing things fail so spectacularly, it forces you to ask a really fundamental question. When everything breaks, who gets to draw up the new blueprint? And what should that blueprint even look like? So in this explainer, we're going to unpack that exact clash of ideas. We'll start with the crisis that made all this massive planning talk even possible. Then we'll look at the two big competing blueprints, the top-down federal plan and a totally radical community-first vision. We'll see how they went head-to-head, and maybe most importantly, what surprising legacy this whole debate left on the world you and I live in today. Okay, first, let's set the scene. It's the 1930s, the country is absolutely on its knees, and for the very first time, this idea of planning on a massive national scale actually enters the American conversation. The scale of the collapse just completely shattered the old belief that the economy would just fix itself. A lot of people started arguing that the government had to step in. And that created this really unique moment in time where big, bold, even kind of radical ideas about redesigning society could actually get a serious hearing. And the first big idea? Well, it came straight from the top. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal wasn't just about handing out aid. It was about totally reimagining the federal government as the nation's master planner. At the very heart of this vision was an agency called the National Resources Planning Board, or the NRPB. You can think of it as an attempt to create a central brain for the entire nation, an organization in Washington coordinating everything from huge public works projects and natural resources to the country's economic policy. So who were the architects behind this grand plan? A group of elite experts, often called the Brains Trust. You had FDR's own uncle, Frederick Delano, who was a seasoned planner. You had Charles Merriam, a political scientist who was a master networker, and Wesley Clare Mitchell, a top economist. These were guys who believed in data, in efficiency, and in solutions led by experts. And this quote, it just perfectly captures their whole philosophy. For them, planning was this scientific, top-down process. Experts provide the data, and then leaders in Washington, D.C. implement the policies to manage the entire national economy in the most rational, efficient way possible. But, not everyone was sold on this big, centralized, expert-driven vision. There was another group of thinkers offering a powerful counter-argument, one that didn't start with the nation, but with the neighborhood. So, let me introduce you to the Regional Planning Association of America, or RPAA. Now, these folks were a band of visionaries who were just deeply fed up with the modern industrial city. They weren't interested in managing some massive national system. They wanted to build a totally different kind of society, literally from the ground up. And their team was filled with poets as much as planners. Lewis Mumford was their powerful public voice. Clarence Stein was the brilliant architect and organizer. You even had Benton MacKaye, the conservationist who dreamed up the Appalachian Trail. This wasn't a group of economists. It was a group of passionate community builders. Their whole goal was to create this network of small, self-sufficient new towns. Now, these wouldn't be suburbs as we know them. They'd be complete communities where people could live, work, and play, all within walking distance and all surrounded by a permanent ring of green space. It was a total rejection of the sprawling, chaotic city of the time. Okay, so when you put these two visions side by side, you start to see they weren't just different plans. No, they were competing philosophies about how people should actually live their lives. First off, just look at the scale. It's night and day. The New Dealers were thinking nationally. How do we manage the resources of an entire continent? The regionalists, on the other hand, were thinking locally. How do we build one good, healthy community, and then another, and then another? And that difference in scale, it leads to totally different ideas about power. The NRPB was your classic top-down model. Federal experts advise, Washington decides, and it flows downwards. The RPAA, they championed decentralization. They believed power should rest with the community, with local people making decisions about their own towns. And their ultimate goals just could not have been more different. The New Dealers were focused on the big economic machine, efficiency, stability, managing huge systems like highways and dams. The regionalists were focused on quality of life. things like community, a connection to nature, the well-being of the individual. One was really about engineering an economy. The other was about cultivating a culture. So what happened? Who won this battle of ideas? Well, the centralized dream, it died a very political death. In 1943, Congress, which was getting really nervous about growing presidential power and what they called creeping socialism, completely defunded and abolished the NRPB. Just like that, America's first and only national planning agency was gone. And the decentralized vision, did it do any better? Not really. It barely got off the drawing board. The federal government did build 3 experimental greenbelt towns based on their principles, but even these tiny projects were seen as too radical, too controversial, and eventually, they were all sold off to private developers after the war. So with both of these deliberate, carefully planned futures defeated, what did America get instead? Well, we got a kind of unplanned future, one that just emerged by default, and ended up shaping the nation more than any single blueprint ever could. This timeline really tells the story. See, in 1943, the National Planning Board gets the axe. Just 4 years later, Levittown is founded, and it creates the blueprint for a very different, market-driven future. It's not until way later, in the 90s, that we see a real organized pushback with new urbanism, which, guess what, echoes the very ideas that were defeated decades before. Levittown was the answer to a massive housing crisis after World War II. It wasn't some grand vision for community or national efficiency. It was a masterclass in mass production. And this model just exploded across the country, not just because of the market, but because federal policies like the GI Bill made these homes super affordable, and the new interstate highway system connected them to cities. It basically paved the way for a car-centric America. But here's where it gets really interesting. Decades later, after living with the consequences of all that suburban sprawl, a new movement pops up. New urbanism. And their core principles? Walkable neighborhoods, mixed-use design, a strong sense of community. It's a direct echo of Lewis Mumford and the RPA's vision from the 1920s. It's proof that sometimes good ideas never really die. So, at the end of the day, the great planning debate of the 1930s left us with a really powerful lesson. It shows us that the shape of our world, our cities, our suburbs, isn't inevitable. It's the result of choices, of battles of ideas that were won and lost. Which kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the defining debates of our time, and whose vision for the future will end up shaping the world we leave behind?